Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Chatham House session on the current situation of Belarus in the context of Russia's war on Ukraine. I'm your moderator this afternoon. My name is Keir Giles, and we have three excellent speakers to talk us through how Belarus's situation is one of the many unexpected aspects of how Russia's war did not go to plan. We'll be hearing about the causes of that, but most importantly, the effects for Belarus itself. A little bit of housekeeping before I introduce the speakers. First of all, everybody, this session is on the record. Please bear in mind that this is on the record. Your questions, if you want to pose them, would be best put in the Q&A section of your Zoom screens, and they will be visible to everybody. Also, there is a translation available into Russian. Поэтому, дорогие гости, если вы хотите слушать этот вебинар по-русски, кликните, пожалуйста, на interpretation на ваших экранах. We have three speakers who will be covering this issue from three separate angles: military, political, and economic aspects of where Belarus finds itself today. I will be getting out of the way as rapidly as possible because we have a short session, a hard stop in 1 hour from now, and we will no doubt have plenty of questions to get through. But I will introduce, first of all, Mathieu Bouleg, who will be covering military aspects. Mathieu is the closely defense-focused analyst within Russia and Eurasia program. We also have Ryhor Astapenia, who is the Belarus Initiative Director within REP for Chatham House. He'll be talking about political aspects of Belarus's current situation and what it means for Minsk's sovereignty. And finally, we have Katerina Bornukova, who is the Academic Director of BEROK, the economic think tank, who'll be talking about Belarus's economic prospects, particularly not only under the impact of individual sanctions, but also as a result of its continuing dependence on Russia. That's enough from me. I'm going to pass it straight over to Mathieu Bouleg.
Thanks a lot, Keir. It's great to be here to discuss this event. So I'm going to make three broad points today. First, on the sort of backtracking to Russia's presence and the buildup in Belarus, how Belarus is now by proxy or by default an aggressor state and an enabler of war operations against Ukraine, and what are the consequences for Belarus and for the wider region. So first, let's look back at when it all started. Basically, when Putin started doodling his war plan on the map and gave it to irresponsible adults in the Kremlin, that ended up with the signature in March 2021 of this 5-year plan between Russia and Belarus, and the opening of this infamous training center in Grodno for joint air defense and for the Air Force, which was understood back then as a form of permanent military presence in disguise. It was not a Russian military base, which has always been a problem in the body politic of Belarus and for Lukashenko sensitivities, but was basically a permanent military presence in disguise. Then came Zapad, 2021 in September, with this logic of how much kit and gear Russia was leaving behind in a form of Trojan horse logic, but also as Russian fighter jets starting patrolling the Belarusian airspace from Baranovichi. Which led then, as if the signs were not already on the wall, to the last straw of the organization of the Union Resolve exercise in February between Russia and Belarus, which saw the largest displacement of Russian troops on the territory of Belarus, about 30,000 troops from the eastern military district of Russia, which were airlifted mostly to Belarus. It was the first time the eastern military district actually practiced on training grounds in Europe, let alone in Belarus. And it was once again the largest deployment of Russian troops in Belarus since the fall of the Soviet Union. A lot of air superiority and defense assets were positioned, S-400s, S-300s air defense systems, but also a lot of artillery systems that basically turned this military exercise into Russia's axis of advance towards Kiev, as we've seen since the start of the war. Importantly enough, the drill focused back then on, and I quote, suppressing and repelling external aggression against the Union state, basically war against Ukraine, as if once again it wasn't code enough for what was happening and what was going to happen. Which leads me to my second point, the war operations per se since February 24th and Russia's renewed aggression or second war against Ukraine in 2022. Belarus has become a proxy aggressor against Ukraine and an enabler to Russian operations against Ukraine. Loads of air operations have been launched from Belarus, from the Baranovichi and Lida air stations. Also a lot of artillery strikes that have become now countless. There's about 5 battalion tactical groups of Belarus forces that have been deployed at the border with Ukraine to support and facilitate Russian operations in terms of logistics, in terms of medical supply, in terms of damage assessment of Russian hardware and resupply for Russian troops. The Russian army has also been using the Belarus transportation network and rail network to funnel military cargo, to funnel air cargo as well from Russia to Belarus in order to support the war effort and the war machine. Also using Belarus military logistics to rotate damaged units and use Belarus as a sort of temporary stationing base for the rotation of military troops. There were also reports, although unconfirmed, that units of Belarus Special Operation Forces were fighting alongside Russian operations for the Battle for Kiev. And the now substantiated evidence that the Eastern Military District is coordinating the siege of Kiev directly from Belarus, and this sort of willingness now to encircle Kiev from the west as Russian forces are regrouping for a new offensive in this battle for Kiev. Now touching upon the consequences, what it means for Belarus and for the wider region. The most important signal is Russia's willingness to drag Belarus and the Lukashenko regime further into this war, to bring Belarus actively into the war and to commit more troops actively in the battle inside of Ukraine. You've probably all seen this false flag operation that happened on the 11th of March when Russia dropped a bomb on Kopani in Belarus to force Minsk into a conflict and to force Lukashenko into making a choice that really isn't his in the first place. And also the US declassified intelligence to bluff Belarus's response and to try to pressure Belarus to come out of the woods and finally make a decision on whether or not to get more active into this war. We've also seen a very shaky rhetoric from Lukashenko evolve from saying that they would not participate to the war and then saying that should a war start, they would fight jointly, quote unquote, before actually backtracking to previous position of it's not our war. So I would argue Lukashenko is doing his best to delay the entry into war at all costs, despite huge pressure from Moscow. The issue is, what can Belarus troops actually do in Ukraine? Because if we believe Russian demand to send units for the fight for Kiev, then there's only very little that these troops can do if we are to believe numbers that Belarus could commit between 7,000 to 10,000 troops in active war fighting. These troops have very little combat experience, probably very little willingness to fight, and even less preparedness for urban warfare and such high intensity operations. So this would not be a game changer for the siege of Kiev. This would actually turn into a slaughterhouse, one dead soldier after the other. Then the other possibility for Belarus troops will be to conduct false flag operations, to try to disperse Ukrainian efforts, to create more axes of advance, for instance, from the border down to Ukraine, in order to exhaust Ukrainian forces. That wouldn't also be a game changer if we are to believe that Russia is now removing its operations, closer to Donbass, in order to slowly freeze positions as they exhaust their military capabilities. So in a way, it's great to call for Belarus forces from Moscow. It's another thing to actually employ them in warfighting situations. And final point on the future of a Russian military presence in Belarus. We all know that Russia's been long pushing and strongly pushing Belarus to host a permanent military base, where none of that really matters anyway, because Russia has now legally invaded Belarus through the presence of this training center in Grodno, through the presence of Russian troops of the Eastern Military District, and Belarus becoming a proxy theater for the war. So as my colleague Andreas Rasch was writing recently, Belarus is now a de facto extension of the Russian Western Military District. So all the discussions around the military base is sort of moot, because once again, Russia has legally invaded the country. Now comes the underpinning of this is considering the amended constitution of the Union States, removing the neutrality of Belarus. Well, neutrality died with the war. The other question is the future of Russian military presence, and notably the often discussed placement of nuclear weapons, Russian nuclear weapons in Belarus. I would argue Russia would actually start with placing mobile systems in Crimea, testing the waters there before they can actually commit to placing and positioning tactical weapons, let alone strategic or theater weapons, to Belarus. And the final sort of point is, now that we have the presence of air defense units of Russia in the Grodno region and beyond in Belarus, this imposes more cost for the Atlantic Alliance and for Western countries in terms of contesting the airspace of the region, with the ever-present risk of horizontal escalation. So plenty to discuss moving forward for the alliance and beyond in terms of the increased military risk that Belarus and the liability that Belarus has become in this endeavor. So I'll stop there and I'll leave the floor to my colleagues. Thank you.
Mathieu, thank you very much. So it's a fascinating picture where the predictions that not only Belarus was part of the Western military district, but even that it was an integrated part of the Russian chain of command with no independent agency haven't actually been borne out by reality. And let's hear from Ryhor now whether that is also the case in terms of Belarus displaying some vestiges of sovereignty now and what that will look like in the future. Ryhor, over to you.
Thanks, Kier. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I will focus on three key changes caused by the fact that Lukashenko is a co-aggressor in this war: the decline of his independence, the decrease in the role of Belarusian agenda for the international community, and the change of the previous theory of change in Belarus. We can start with the fact that Lukashenko's independence and the sovereignty of Belarus is seriously questioned. As Matthew described, Lukashenko provided the Kremlin with the military infrastructure, territory, and as a result, Belarus has come under such wide-ranging Western sanctions that the country has remained only informal relations with the West. On the other hand, we have Russia, which has almost complete control over the Belarusian foreign policy, over the economy. The Russian army has entered the territory of Belarus and may not leave it in the foreseeable years. I think that Katerina will talk profoundly about the Western economic sanctions, but I will just bring them back together to the two most important political things. First is that Western policy on Belarus comes down to the idea that Western sanctions against Belarus should be almost a mirror image of Western sanctions against Russia. This idea is just to prevent Russian subsession companies from bypassing Western sanctions through Belarusian shim companies. The second issue is that the West sees few opportunities in seeking understanding with Lukashenko. At the end of February, Macron called Lukashenko, hoping that he could get Lukashenko out of this war and of Putin's pocket as well. But it ended in nothing. And for the West, the situation is quite simple and quite obvious that neither Lukashenko nor his ruling class wanted this war. They probably dream right now about being again in the situation of 2014 when Lukashenko and his ruling class, they were kind of on the sidelines of the Russian war against Ukraine. But the fact is that actually we are not in the 2014, and to bring Belarus out of the war, Lukashenko needs to get somewhere, I don't know, a magic drink elixir for adequate thinking and willingness to act and to start making very serious and even dangerous steps for him. This of course would be much appreciated by the West, but the problem is that actually Lukashenko doesn't have enough agency, enough willingness to get Belarus out of this war. And this is why many actions of the regime just come down to ensuring that in return of our binding to the Russian sinking stone, this sinking stone will provide us with cheap oil and gas supplies, give us access to the Russian import substitution programs, postpone payments of loans, etc. The second point, the second change caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and Lukashenko's participation in it is that Belarusian internal agenda, its relevance, its importance for the international community decreased. Undoubtedly, repression in Belarus now seems less critical compared to Russia's war in Ukraine. Therefore, now the Belarusian democratic community needs to spend much more effort to prove to the world that actually it's Lukashenko, not Belarusians, who are participating in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Therefore, I'm glad that actually I will show several slides now. I'm glad that despite the fact that the terrible conditions for conducting public opinion polls in Belarus, the Chatham House Belarus Initiative conducts many of them, and our data shows that actually most Belarusians do not support allowing Russian troops to use Belarusian military infrastructure and the territory for the war against Ukraine. We see that actually most Belarusians do not support the deployment of Russian weapons in Belarus or setting up more military bases inside the country. And also we see that actually very few people, only 3% of people of Belarusian population approve the fact that the idea of the Belarusian army taking a full part in the military action in Ukraine on the Russian side. That's pretty it. By the way, we have launched the website with all of the data. It's called belarusbolls.org. Please use it, and you can check the slides there that I have just shown. Anyway, we see that that despite the fact that actually Belarusians again are against the war, actually Belarusian democratic movement needs a lot of time to prove to the world that actually Belarus doesn't support this war and we shouldn't be treated as Lukashenka. The last thing that I would like to say in the introductory part is that the theory of democratic changes in Belarus has changed, and many people doubt that any changes at all are possible if Russian troops remain in Belarus, and if Lukashenko remains controlled by the Kremlin and continuous repressions, if the Belarusian situation only worsens as it has been doing for the last 18 months, and if Putin remains in power and sponsors all of this, so how the democratic change can take place at all? On the other hand, I think there is a chance that one or several elements of this puzzle that I just described, they can break in the coming years, and then everything fall apart. And then if Belarusian democratic and international stakeholders are united by a common agenda and resources to implement it, then this Belarusian puzzle can be reassembled in such a way that not only Belarusian society, but the entire region wins and becomes more safer. So I hope that this end slightly improved my little bit depressing introductory speech. Thanks a lot, and we'll be happy to answer questions later.
Well, Richard, thanks for that optimistic ending. You've painted a picture of both Lukashenko and Belarus being forced again down a direction that Russia wants, but is not entirely sitting happily with either the leader or the population, but with even greater restrictions on the freedom of movement and the options that are available. I'm sure that we are going to get questions about what specifically either Lukashenko or the population could do about this situation now and in the future. But a lot of it, of course, is tied up with the economic prospects. You mentioned a few times there, something that we'll be hearing more about, I'm sure, from Katerina now. Just what are the options in terms of economic dependence and releasing itself from economic dependence on Russia for Belarus? Katerina, you please.
Thank you for having me. Let me show you some slides. So when we talk about the Belarusian economy and the impact of sanctions, and not only sanctions, because the impact of the war is much larger, I'll talk about it later. It's important to remember that Belarus is a small open economy, unlike Russia. It's very dependent on exports. So exports is over 70% of GDP. And the main destinations of these exports are, well, first of all, Russia, but also the EU and Ukraine together are as important as Russia, actually. So together, Russia, EU, and Ukraine, parties involved in conflict, either politically or directly, comprise over 80% of Belarusian exports. So the role of the EU is actually even larger in trade and services, which is not depicted here. And there, the role of the UK and the USA is also important because we talk about IT services and transportation services, first of all. So let me talk a little bit about the sanctions. Belarus was already under Western sanctions before the beginning of the war. They were deliberately designed in such a way that there were a lot of loopholes, delays, etc. So they were more like a signaling device rather than a punishing device at that moment. But the only thing that actually hurt the Belarusian economy was the Lithuanian ban on the transit of potash fertilizers, main Belarusian export, which actually goes to China, Brazil, and India. After the beginning of the war, the West has introduced new sanctions. The EU introduced stronger trade sanctions, which, well, first of all, they entered into effect immediately. There were no delays, like ongoing contracts should be closed right now. They also have wider scope. So if before that was sanctions on petrochemicals and potash, now we have sanctions on a wider range of materials exported to the EU, and now it counts to up to 70% of Belarusian exports to the EU. And then a separate thing is financial sanctions, which were really harsh. What happened is that EU froze operations with national bank reserves, basically freezing the reserves, in fact. The US didn't do that. So there is, this is where we see the difference between the sanctions levied on Russia with the sanctions which Belarus faces right now. Belarus sanctions are lighter at this moment. The US has also blocked Belvap together with its Russian mother company VAB, and it also sanctioned two more Belarusian banks. SWIFT, 3 banks are disconnected from SWIFT. So now the banking system is like, it's filled with different types of sanctions. If you look at the 6 strategically important banks in the Belarusian banking system, only one of them, one founded by Raiffeisen, Prior Bank, remains sanction-free. Others are affected. So these sanctions are going to hurt, and we see immediate effects on the financial markets, on the banking market, first of all. And what you see on this graph is the dynamics of the exchange rate. So the higher is the value, the lower is the value of the Belarusian ruble, right? So it's the amount of Belarusian rubles per $1, and you see that if just before the war it was 265, it went as high as 330. And this is under a lot of administrative constraints on the banking market. So it's quite difficult to buy currency. Currency operations within banking are restricted. Banks introduced a lot of other restrictions, like, for example, in consumer lending, just to be able to keep going. People cannot withdraw deposits easily, although, again, the restrictions are not as harsh as in Russia, where you cannot buy currency altogether. In Belarus, there are limits, but still, people still have access to the currency. And then some immediate effects. The immediate effects is that Belarus has become toxic. Companies are leaving Belarus, but not as many companies leave Belarus as they leave Russia. Some of them are only leaving Russia and remain in Belarus. So tours from Russia to Belarus to eat in McDonald's is still possible. Belarus sees logistic problems. For example, the logistics, the automotive transit from Poland is being blocked by volunteers. There are multiple problems on the railways, etc. So these are the immediate effects. But I think what we are not seeing right now in the statistics, but what would be much more important in terms of long-run impact, is effects through the trade partners. Now, if we look at the three major trade partners of Belarus, 3 major markets for its exports, well, Ukrainian market is basically gone for Belarus as of now. So Ukraine is actually withholding right now some of the equipment which was transported through the Ukraine. Ukraine, 14% of our exports is just evaporated. The EU market, 70% of it is under this or that form of sanctions. If we look at the Russian market, it's projected to contract the Russian GDP is projected to contract by at least 10%. In 2015, it contracted like only 4%, and Belarus had a recession for 2 years, which amounted to almost 7% of GDP contraction. So now we are facing Russian market contraction of 10%. We can imagine that that could translate into even more GDP contraction only through this trade channel for Belarus. Another thing I would like to mention is impact on the IT sector. IT sector, why I'm separating is because it was the only source of growth, the only sector which was growing steadily over the last 10 years in Belarus. Now what we see is that, well, first of all, clients demand that companies relocate, that companies stop paying taxes in Belarus and finance the war against Ukraine. Product companies fear brand consequences, of course. Employees themselves want to leave because they have fears of conscription. And we have multiple IT services discontinued as companies pull out of Belarus. According to the largest IT portal in Belarus, DevBuy, 27% of IT employees already, well, they say that they have already left the country, and 28% are preparing to leave. And relocation is prevalent, unfortunately, among senior IT specialists, not juniors. Of course, I don't think that, half of the IT sector would just stand up and leave, but it's very possible that a quarter would depart Belarus by the end of the year. What about the possible compensating factors? One usual factor is Russia. Usually when Belarus has sanctions problems, it goes to Russia for loan, but now Russia is into problems itself. So instead of a new loan, Russia has offered so far only debt restructuring. So Belarus will not be seeing any live money, at least for now. Russia has also offered, according to Belarusian Prime Minister, Russia has offered ruble payments for energy, but it doesn't mean that prices would be connected to ruble, right? So just payments would be connected to the Russian rubles. As for Belarus participation in Russia import substitution programs, I am very skeptical about that because that programs never worked in the past. Another possibility is that Belarus becomes a way of helping Russia overcome sanctions, since the sanctions on Belarus are less harsh. This approach worked in 2014, but it worked because it was actually, Belarus was overcoming sanctions levied by Russia, right? So counter sanctions on bans of food imports from the EU. It worked for Belarus. Belarus successfully re-exported, for example, Polish apples to the EU. I don't think that would be the case now. I think that the oversight of how sanctions work would be much harsher right now, and I don't think that Belarus would be a good way to overcome sanctions for Russia. Actually, other countries of the Eurasian Economic Union have much more possibilities to play that role. So I don't think any of these compensating factors would play a huge role, although to some limit, maybe yes. So what could we expect going forward? Just by looking at this export graph, you could see that it's very easy to lose around 35 or 40% of exports for Belarus. My colleague has made calculations based on macroeconomic model, and he showed that it translates into up to 20% of GDP loss, which might not happen over this year exactly, it might happen over 1 or 2 years, but it is very much a possibility. We're also going to face very high inflation as people will put both, all kinds of risks, devaluation risk, logistic risks into their prices. Unemployment is not likely to be very high. 8% is high for Belarus. The normal level is 3-4%, but the labor markets are very flexible in Belarus. So we believe that we will not see a lot of unemployment everywhere, but the situation, in particular in the regions, would be quite drastic. There are still risks of a wide banking sector crisis, financial crisis. crisis. And of course, in the long run, we look at the long-term stagnation because there are no prospects of growth, and we will be linked even more than today to the stagnating Russian economy. Thank you. That's all on my side.
Katerina, thank you very much for so clearly laying out that particularly grim picture, and especially that point that Ryhor also mentioned about the prospects for Belarus being used as a route for sanctions evasion by Russia and where exactly that might lead. And thanks also to all of our panelists for being crisp and keeping to time, because that means that we have 28.5 minutes left for questions and answers. Ladies and gentlemen, do please continue to put your Q&A into that Q&A function in Zoom. I'm going to start off by dealing with one very quick and simple admin question. Łukasz Byrski has asked if the links mentioned in particular by Ryhor can be provided. Yes, the backstage staff will be placing those in the chat functions. If you haven't spotted them there yet, or if there's anything missing, please do keep an eye on that, and the links will be available there. And then there's a question here that came in quite early from Philip Lingard, asking about the prospects for civil uprising against Lukashenka. Specifically, he asked, what are the prospects for that kind of civil uprising renewing? Now, it's probably a question for Ryhor, but I would like to piggyback on that as well, because there's an aspect of the Belarusian military posture that Mathieu didn't touch on, but which I think is particularly fascinating, and that's how that applies to the military as well. We've seen the suggestion that there is dissent among the Belarusian chain of command, that there is a refusal to be involved in the war, that some of the Belarusian non-participation that we've seen before up until now is as a direct result of refusing orders, practically outright mutiny. And I'd like to hear how Mathieu assesses that. Should we believe these, and is it actually plausible, and what might be the long-term results? But first, if I can turn to you, Ryhor, and say, civil uprising, civil dissent, what are the prospects for that in Belarus now?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the problem is that with the current level of repression and the fear and immigration from the country of the most active participants of previous protests, and with Russian troops actually inside the country, it's very difficult to imagine mass protests against Lukashenko or against Russia, because people just they're not just afraid. Fear it's not the main demotivator here. It's also the actually prospects of winning the regime under the current conditions. They are very difficult to imagine, and that is why it's demotivating people to protest at all. The thing that I think is possible, that actually can become a trigger for mass protests, is actually if Lukashenko sends Belarusian troops to Ukraine. But again, I'm very doubt about that, that it's possible. And that is why I think in general that any prospects for civil uprising or like mass protests, it's not very realistic right now.
Thanks, Ryhor. And Mathieu, what about on the military side? Any actual dissent within the forces?
Right, thank you, Kira. It's a good question, and we've seen reports indeed, but coming mostly from Ukrainian sources. With all that, it needs to be taken into consideration, considering the fact that Ukraine wins the information war, but it's a war, so it's information propaganda. So these reports, I don't have the actual evidence that there has been some dissent of the few thousand Belarus soldiers who've been fostering and enabling military logistics for Russia on the territory of Belarus. So these reports still remain unsubstantiated. The fact of the matter is that depending on the scale, if and only if Belarus enters the war actively and troops are dispatched into Ukraine, it'll all depend on the tasks and the missions that they are given. I would argue, if of course there is integration inside a wider Russian command and control system, that these troops would be used for spearhead operations, for false flags mostly, to try to disperse Ukrainian attention and Ukrainian forces, to dissolve them a little bit at the border. These missions would be highly contested by Ukraine and would probably bring a lot of attrition and loss from the Belarus side, which would impact morale and then probably cause as well a lot of issues concerning upholding discipline. If these troops, on the other hand, are committed to the battle for Kiev, as let's call it what it is, cannon fodder for urban warfare operations, then this will increase, of course, the level of the level of attrition and decrease what is already very little willingness to fight, I would argue, from the Belarusian side. Whether this will then impact the more political and civil uprising side of things, I think it's up to my colleagues to respond. Riho already made the assessment. I also don't think this would turn actively into a massive upheaval moving forward.
Thanks, Mathieu. And there's a very quick follow-up for you here as well on a similar theme from Duncan Pickard. He's asking, could you please comment on Russia's use of Belarusian territory to stage attacks by mercenaries against Ukraine? And I think that comes down to the same issue of where we're hearing this from.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know that Russia has been dispatching a mix of private military companies, but also private soldiers of fortune coming from Syria, coming from other places, redispatched forces from Transnistria, from Karabakh, and so on, to commit to the war effort against Ukraine. That they have been using Belarus as an airlift or as a stationing ground for these troops, yes, of course, because at this stage, Belarus is one of the crooks, one of the three basically fulcrums or axes, strategic direction, sorry, of the war against Ukraine, and the territory of Belarus is one of the key nodes of resupply of military logistics and troops and artillery systems, of course, specifically for the Battle of Kiev. So yes, the fact that Belarus has been once again used as an enabler for military logistics and troops displacement is a fact. Whether there were mercenaries, private military companies, and so on, yes, of course, the numbers remain unknown, but yes, of course, they would have been used for airlifts and ground operations.
Thanks very much, Mathieu. And a question now for Katerina and for Riho probably as well. Sofia Sitsinka is asking about the China angle. Let's not forget that, of course, one of the poles of Belarus's multi-vector foreign policy was supposed to be China. She's asking now in the context of a meeting between Lukashenka and the Chinese ambassador, Lukashenka may be afraid of a possible loss by Putin, losing the war, which would weaken Lukashenka's regime. Sofia asks, do you believe that in the near future, Belarus's pivot to Asia will be manifesting even more? So Katerina, perhaps you could comment, and then Rihor afterwards.
Yeah, I think that it's very wrong for us to believe that this pivot is in Belarus' hands, that Belarus just decides to pivot to Asia and Asia is welcoming and waiting, especially China. Instead, what we see from 2020 is that China economically has actually stopped investing as much as it did, has stopped financing Belarusian government through loans. We are actually, since the political crisis, we are only paying back our loans to China, not getting anything new from them. We are not getting a lot of new investments, only those investment lines which were already signed and started, and some of them are actually pulled out after the sanctions were levied, for example, on the construction of new potash mining plant. So I would not, there are these talks about the turn to Asia. They started a very long time ago and they don't materialize because Belarus is not capable of entering Asian markets and there are no political will on China's side to support Belarus specifically. Again, we should understand that China views Russia and Belarus differently, and Belarus is just one of 100 countries which has lost its only distinguishing factor being the logistical bridge between Europe and Russia.
Thanks. Rihor, any thoughts?
Yeah, I will just add 2 cents here. I think we should understand about Chinese policy towards Belarus is that actually China wants Belarus to be an open country which has good relations with the West, with the rest of the world, and that is why investments in Belarus can be like transported to the West, and they can, for example, Belarus can become a hub, logistic hub for China, for transporting goods to the EU countries. And if there are so harsh sanctions from the EU against Belarus, so what the whole point for China to invest in Belarus? They do not want to invest in the wall. they would like to invest in the logistical hubs. And that is why I doubt a lot that any kind of Chinese help is possible under current conditions.
Well, so much for China. How about Africa? We have a question from Saleh Kamil Saleh, who's talking about Belarusian commercial relations with Africa. He says, Belarus has developed commercial relations with African countries, namely exporting mining and agricultural equipment and arms. In the light of the sanctions regime, will and should Belarus's commercial relations with African countries be targeted? How about reverse order? Ihor and then Katerina?
Yeah, sure. I will just say that it's pretty the same question. And maybe we should add here that it's very difficult right now. It's become much more difficult than it was previously to transport goods from Belarus. For example, I'm from Saligor, so I know a little bit about the Belaruskali, which produces potash fertilizers, which is one of the main goods from Belarus. And actually, right now, Belaruskali lost all of its ports because previously Belaruskali used ports in Lithuania and Ukraine. And that is why it's very difficult right now to just to sell anything. And as far as I know, they had to find a port in Georgia, and that is why they're transporting all their goods to Georgia and then to Brazil, for example. So that's why I cannot imagine that actually any kind of trade will be growing with far away states, because it's just very difficult to transfer goods there. And again, there is a question of sanctions. No one wants to go into the sanctions for working with Belarus.
Thanks. Katerina?
Yeah, and let me add on macroeconomic level that Africa was never a very important market, and I don't think it has a potential to become such for Belarus. Again, we don't know much about the African market. We don't have experience or capacities to work there, and what was happening there was mainly in the interest of several individuals, not in the interest of the whole country. So I don't think that we should put special efforts on looking at Africa especially, but again, sanctions, for example, on the production of weapons, which affects both Belarus and Russia, they would do most of the trick, I guess.
Thanks. And just one more question on the economic aspects, and particularly on evading sanctions, just before we swing back into looking at military and political issues. There's a question from Babatunde Akim, who says, what is the feasibility of Russia and Belarus in using cryptocurrency to evade sanctions effect? And what could be the consequences of that strategy? I think that's probably one for you, Katerina.
Well, it's difficult to discuss this. It's a possibility always, but then, this is just one side of the transaction, the financial one. The other side of the transaction is actual movement of goods. And we see that there are huge problems with logistics right now, and this is something that could still be tracked and seen, right? So, for example, for Belarusian exports for potash in particular, potash comes in huge volumes. This is not something that could be unseen, and I think the same applies to major exports of Russia. I mean, oil and gas. You cannot just, export them without anyone noticing, because again, this is noticeable. The movement of goods, you could spot it even if you use cryptocurrencies to pay for it. So I don't think this is like a panacea for all the problems.
Okay, no magic bullet there. Mattia, back to you for the next one. And it's back on a Russian presence in Belarus. Aikododen asks, how real, and you touched on this in your opening remarks, but maybe you can expand a little bit further, how real is the likelihood of Belarus hosting nuclear weapons, given the result of the recent referendum? Again, what is written on paper versus reality? What do you think there?
Thanks, Kir. It's a great question. I mean, everything that's written on paper should be both believed and completely disbelieved, in as much as Russia's nuclear doctrine is just a smokescreen for intentions and does adapt to the reality of the situation. So listen, it's not because a referendum is turning the sort of nuclear-free status of Belarus, that automatically Russia will try to move tactical theater or strategic nuclear weapons on the territory of Belarus. That they would potentially rotate mobile Iskander systems that can be nuclear tipped as part of their bluff or as part of escalation. Yes, that is absolutely possible. That they would start building silos to host strategic weapons on the territory of Belarus is another thing. I would look closer to Crimea and potential discussions around placing said nuclear systems, both mobile and static, into the peninsula to actually show and enact the last stage of Russia's reappropriation, quote unquote, of the illegally occupied territory. But for Belarus, it's more a question for me of short-term bluff and the use of the nuclear escalatory ladder than the direct placement of nuclear systems in Belarus, for a very simple reason. Should the country go through upheavals or regime change, then these systems would actually fall into the hands of potential political opposition that Russia would be very and highly uncomfortable with. Also because these systems are mobile, yes, if you deploy tactical nuclear weapons, but they're not that fast. So it would also be a question of moving them back into Russian territory or exfiltrate them from Russian territory unbeknownst to Belarus forces or to other eyes and scrutiny. So it's sort of it's a wild card, but I would argue it would be used mostly as tactical bluff than anything.
Thanks. So again, it's rhetoric and diplomacy versus practicality. We have a few slightly more philosophical questions piling up in the Q&A, which I'm hoping to save for each speaker's closing remarks and give them a chance to group them together and give us their final thoughts. There's just one more, and I suspect it's a question with some very short answers, but I'm going to let each of our panelists respond to it. It's from Philip Lingard, and he says, during the February military exercises, Russian troops were stationed within 50 kilometers of Vilnius, 200 kilometers of Warsaw, close to the Suwałki Gap. Here's the question: do NATO or the EU have any leverage to get those troops and material removed? And as I said, it might be a very swift answer, but Mathieu, first, your thoughts on that.
So the Suwałki Gap is an interesting one, right? Because it's one of the military myths that we've been feeding and self-deterring about for the past decade or so, or even more, in terms of actual Russian capabilities to close off entire swaths of Polish territory to sort of create a bridge between Kaliningrad and mainland Russia, and therefore putting Belarus at risk of military advances from Russia, using the territory of Belarus as a sort of freeway of advance. So considering the state of Russian capabilities, and this will be my answer to the question, considering the fact that we've seen not the 12 feet tall giants that we thought the Russian army was, neither have we seen the 4 feet tall giant in a way that, because Russian military capabilities still need to be reckoned with. But the Suwałki Gap is more a myth about Russia's ability to move in force against allied and specifically NATO territory than an actual reality of how war would actually pan out and how easy Russia would be able to seize terrain quickly inside contested territories and advance its military strategic goals. It is more an act of self-deterrence from the West than a reality in terms of warfighting operations. Once again, considering what we've seen in the battlefield in Ukraine for the past month now. So this will be my job at an answer.
Thanks, Mathieu. And Rychał, what do you think in terms of leverage by NATO or the EU on that presence of Russian troops? And there's a related question just come in from Christopher Gord, who's saying more broadly, what do you see as the main weaknesses of both Russia and Belarus and how they could be exploited by the West? What do you think?
Thanks. Well, I think that the main weakness is an economical one. It becomes very clear to everyone that economy in Belarus will collapse. And many people afraid of huge socioeconomic consequences of this one. The prices will be rising, enterprises will stop working, and there will be no money to actually to pay people, to pay pensions, etc. And I think this is one of the realities that we will face in the near future. Of course, on the other hand, there is still a Russia that can compensate losses for the Belarusian economy, and it will not cost much compared with Russian reserves. But it's still a question for the Russian ruling class whether they would like to actually to pay for Lukashenka. And I actually doubt that many of them will be willing to spend money on Lukashenka instead of spend money on themselves.
Thanks. Katerina, would you agree?
Yes, I would support in general, so nothing to add.
Okay, we have 9 minutes left, and I mentioned that we had some of the slightly more philosophical, possibly even rhetorical questions that we have left till the end. So I'd like to ask each of our speakers just to give any final thoughts, but in order to feed that, let me just read out some of the others that have been presented to us. There's Arkady Moshes, who's saying, if troops are deployed in a country with the consent of the government, can it be qualified an invasion in legal terms? I think Arkady is asking, should we really be calling this a Russian invasion of Belarus if we don't consider Lukashenko a legitimate leader of Belarus? We've also got a question from Alexander Kopzik, who's saying that Belarusians asked for sanctions against both Belarus and Russia. So can we say that the current situation results from the weak reaction of the EU? If Lukashenko had been stopped in 2020-21, then Putin would not have the support of Belarus today. So there's a counterfactual for you. And finally, a nice one to round off on from John Fitzpatrick. What is the likelihood that Lukashenko would attempt to escape Belarus? And John's talking about if there's a return to the massive protest like in 2020 after the election. I think you've already ruled that out, but are there any other circumstances in which we might see Lukashenko do a runner? So let's take it in reverse order. Katerina, if you wouldn't mind very briefly wrapping up your final thoughts, and then we'll go over to Mattia.
Yes, so again, the economic situation in Belarus would very much depend on how this situation with the war develops and whether Belarus actually deploys its own troops or remains at the current level of involvement in the conflict. And as for Lukashenko's possibilities to look for new partnerships, well, he is always willing to. He always knows that he needs to find another partner either in the West or in the East, aside from Russia. But right now, I don't see a lot of possibilities for him economically. So as for economic consequences of the economic crisis for the potential of another protest, well, we did see some protest in Belarus, which was inspired by economic difficulties in the past. But I don't think that we are in that point now because of the reasons Rigor stated, because of the level of depression, of repressions that the society is experiencing. I'm afraid that the current economic crisis might not lead to protest, but might lead to some discontent from the elites. Again, well, but it's, you know, just a small addition to Belarus being dragged into war, this economic part of the agenda. So I don't think the economy would play a huge role for the political future, but of course it will play a huge role for the well-being of ordinary Belarusians.
Okay, so if it's not the economy, Riho, what else could play a big role in changing the path we're on?
I think that, of course, the way how this war ends, will have a huge influence, a huge impact on the way how things will develop in Belarus. It seems that Lukashenko is disappointed, and he wasn't happy from the very beginning, but it seems that right now that it's becoming more and more obvious that Putin is much weaker than it was thought, and it's becoming, and that's why Lukashenko and other people in the ruling class, they're considering other options, what they can do to avoid Western sanctions. And I think this is what will be one of the key questions that will influence on how the Belarusian ruling class will behave in the future, that they will try to actually to do something about sanctions, because the current sanctions are very huge and they will be even strengthened in the future. And that is why they will be willing to find a solution to somehow to improve relations with the West. Or they will become just a North Korea. It's also an opportunity, a possibility here. But in general, I think that they will try to do something to actually to improve relations, just to avoid this fate of North Korea. Talking about the invasion, whether we should say that actually Belarus was occupied by Russia and that actually Russia invaded Belarus, etc. I think, of course, Lukashenko is illegitimate, and of course we can say that Belarus is under control of a legitimate leader, etc. But actually, what doesn't change in real politics? I mean, like the problem is that, of course, we can say that, but does it change anything in Belarus? Does it change anything for the country? I doubt that, and that is why I think that, of course, we can say that, but it will not have any policy implications right now. That's pretty it. And probably there was a question about the role of well, I saw that question just a second. It was about should the West do something about Belarus previously, so there will be no war of Russia against Ukraine. Of course, for me as for Belarusian, it's uncountable truth that actually without Belarus, this war would be a little bit different, and probably Ukrainian situation will be much better. And we should all of us understand that actually the problem was that this crisis of Belarus wasn't solved. And I just don't want to go right now about the discussion about what the West should do then, sanctions, no sanctions dialogue, but we have just several minutes before the end of the discussion. But what is important to understand that actually that if we have a crisis, we should solve it. We shouldn't leave it as it was left a year ago, and that's why we have the consequences. We see the consequences that we are seeing right now.
Thanks, Ryhor. So yes, the Ukraine situation would have been better without Belarus. Mateo, just a quick final word from you, if you have any thoughts on the progress of the war and where we might go next and what impact that might have, because as we've heard, so much is tied up with whether Putin will actually succeed or suffer a visible failure. Mateo, your last thoughts, please.
I mean, extremely quickly, I think, there cannot be a failure for Putin himself. He needs a face-saving moment. He needs this exercise of legitimacy. May the 9th is approaching as well, that will allow him in a way to turn a very precarious, bogged down quagmire into a form of victory. It will be a victory on the cheap. It'll be symbolic, but it will be for the Russian population to then transform this losing edge into a form of diplomatic victory in a way, to bring something on the table during the negotiations that are unfolding at the moment in Turkey. Whether this drags Belarus into the war, this will also be a question of our own policy in the West and more broadly in democratic nations. Should we choose to close the loopholes and sanction completely Belarus with the risk of driving the regime into a tighter leash towards Moscow, or should we use it as a trade-off or as an off-ramp for Belarus to not sanction, but promise in exchange that Belarus will resist Russia's pressure into going into this war? Very complicated discussions that I'm sure we'll have time to explore as we move forward into Russia's war against Ukraine.
Mathieu, thank you very much. So much to play for, and as ever, what happens will be as much a result of Western policy reactions to Russia and Belarus as to what actually happens on the ground. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening, and thanks in particular to our three excellent panelists. It's been a very dense hour, and I suspect people will be listening over this again to pull out all of those different conclusions. But do please also follow Russia and Eurasia program and the publications of each of the individuals we've heard from today. They are rich in insights, they are rich in foresight, and I strongly recommend reading them in detail and closely. Thank you to everybody that's tuned in. It's been a very well-attended seminar with almost 150 people joining, which is a good number, and it's a topical subject, of course, to be looking at right today. Thanks to everybody, and goodbye, and see you next time.